I wanted to make a contribution to the thoughts that have been sometimes indirectly, often directly, exchanged between Bernardo Kastrup, John Vervaeke, Matt Segall, and Philip Goff around Kastrup's Bernardo's idea of idealism. And I particularly wanted to do it because I feel that Dante has some crucial ideas and also images that might be illuminating. After all, in the Divine Comedy, he describes his journey to the heart of consciousness in all its fullness, by which I mean both phenomenal conscious and metacognitive consciousness, to use Bernardo's terms, and maybe even more, given it's the origin of consciousness in the divine life as well. Now, this is in part a kind of critique, but it's also, I hope, a way of taking and following Bernardo's leads. He often says that in one mode he speaks to a scientific audience, and so that limits the way he speaks, and then in another context he will speak, say, more poetically. And so that's part of this expansion of his views, as much as wondering about certain aspects of the way that he puts things as well. And it, alongside Dante, it's also to use Trinitarian ideas. Now, the Trinity is not popular outside of Christian circles, and in a way, even in Christian circles, its ontological significance, I feel, has almost been killed by ethical or social readings of the Trinity, as if it's a model of how we should do relationships rather than being an insight into reality itself. But I'm going to use the Trinitarian ideas as unpacking the dynamics of being. So that's what I hope to offer. Let me begin with the concerns as a kind of starting point. And there are three broad concerns that have come to my mind with engaging with what Bernardo says and writes, tremendous as they are. And they really are. This is about honing and offering something that I might add or unpack. The first is the idea that mind at large, or cosmic mind, is of itself aboriginally blind, purely instinctive, and needs more than itself to know itself, and so creates a withdrawal or split within itself that then becomes other to itself, that can look back and know the cosmic mind or be loved by the cosmic mind. These are various ideas that arise in 17th century European esotericism. This is where Bernardo appeals to the very remarkable phenomenon of dissociative identity disorder as suggestive of how these splits alters our sense of being separate subjects might have arisen within cosmic mind. Now, there's more to say about that, but for the moment, to stick with these esoteric ideas of God, I think they have an inadequate conception of God, an idea of the divine which was far richer and fuller, in my view, had been lost at that point. And it's returning to that fuller view that I want to suggest here. Also, the idea that cosmic mind detected a lack in itself that needed something radically new for which it derived a plan seems to me to be already a bit metacognitive, but this new thing was supposed to deliver the metacognition to aboriginal mind at large. So I'm wondering if there's a bit of a contradiction there. Even if that's not so, there are all sorts of problems to do with the emergence of novelty in this proposal. This is a variant on how something can come out of nothing, that which didn't exist in any way before. So broadly, I think there's better ways to understand divine nature. The second concern arises from being a psychotherapist and being wary of the kind of psychology that makes generalizations based on psychological conditions. It's the kind that, in its worst popular forms, spots, say, types of human delusion identified under artificial conditions like lab circumstances, and concludes, say, that we're all therefore deluded. Now, Bernardo's not doing that, but I prefer an understanding of the psyche that about what it can as well as what it can't do, plus asking what it might be capable of. So this is using psychology, understanding, experience to explore the limits of our capacities and take a peek over the horizon of those limits. It's a bit more Platonic in this way, like Plato's aporia in the dialogues, which are supposed to take us to a moment of receptivity, of revelation from wider reality, which is what you might expect to be possible, given that we are embedded, are part of cosmic mind or God. Why wouldn't that speak to us as much as we might speak to that? The third area has to do with dissociation in particular, and being wary of reliance on it, for all that it is very suggestive and interesting. But I'm struck that a lot of Bernardo's sympathetic critics sense that something's not quite right around this dissociation issue, and I share that wariness, but for slightly different reasons, I think. I mean, I'm very conscious that we all dissociate. Dissociative identity disorder, which is what Bernardo discusses, it's only an extreme, concrete form of the way that we all adopt different personas depending on context, time of life, and so on. Plus, we tend to be leaky alters. It's not a perfect form of cutting off, which is a telling detail that I'll come to. And even in its extreme form of DID, there must be some leakiness, which is why DID can hope to be treated. But the general point for the moment is that dissociation is not actually a good way to know yourself. It's defensive, it's reactive. It tends towards the instinctive and unthinking, for all that it can be very powerful. That said, there is something that, at least in part, is akin to dissociation that is found in religious and wisdom traditions as at least part of the source of human individuality. So you might say that the fall of Adam is a kind of dissociation because he becomes more aware of himself in isolation from the divine life, and so covers himself in shame. In the myth of the Odyssey and Odysseus, it's sometimes said that Odysseus's cunning as an individual cuts himself off from the natural forces that are around him, and so he wanders almost forever across the Mediterranean Sea, certainly for decades, until finally the gods have mercy on him and lead him back. It's in even Asian traditions as well. So if you read the Xuanzi, you know that Xuanzi will talk about the ancient man being at one with the fire, at one with the air, at one with the water, at one with the earth, and that the search of Xuanzi for the Tao is to return to that state in some way. So this idea of being a rupture or a wound as key to individuality is in many wisdom traditions, and also is in modern psychoanalysis. You know, Lacanians will tell us that it's a rupture from the real that leads us to a sense of being individuals, and so there's a pain built into being an individual. It's a primal wound. But this raises the question of what the fall actually is, and I think it's only half the story when it's told in this way. And what I've been thinking about more since I actually had a direct conversation myself with Bernardo is that dissociation isn't the only things that minds do. I mentioned to him then that we project and we introject too. I didn't know quite what to do with those observations at that point, which is why I've been thinking about it since. But projection is the use of fantasy and imagination to reach out into reality. And when it's imaginative rather than just fantastical, the imaginative projection lands on reality and returns an aspect of reality to us, to the mind. And so it's expansive. It makes us feel more aware, at home, engaged, participative in life. Whereas fantasy doesn't take us anywhere and so tends to fall away. So that's the positive aspect of projection, which you find described in figures like Donald Winnicott. And then introjection is the taking in of what imagination returns to us, the truth-bearing aspect of the projective activity. And we experience that as inspiration or as expansion of our awareness. So the dissociation, when coupled to projection and introjection, creates a whole new sense of what minds might do. And this is in Dante too, actually. He discusses an early version of what came to be called in figures like Donald Winnicott, Melanie Klein, modern British psychotherapy, object relations theory. So my question is, might all three mechanisms have a key part to play in this story of how we are part of the one mind and yet know ourselves as separate individuals too? We have personas, you might say. I want to return to more of that by bringing in a second kind of key constructive thought, I hope, which is to reflect on a key feature of Dante's journey into consciousness in all its fullness, into the divine life. Because it's so striking that in the Paradise in particular, individuality increases as divinity becomes more conscious to Dante and also to the souls that he meets. In fact, it's stressed so much that Dante must know himself fully before he can know the divine life fully. The two actually go together. He must see his face, it's even said. Now, this is partly to reflect on a very odd detail in the Paradise, which is that for much of the journey, he doesn't see the faces of the souls he meets. He's told that he can't see them yet, and he only sees their light, sort of detects their radiance, hears what they have to say and communicate, but doesn't see their face. And this is face not as the sight of our organs of perception, but it's the face which is the divine presence. You know, when we meet another person, particularly in the face, we detect their foibles, their soul, you might say, their personality, but also something of their unique value, of their divine presence. That's, I think, what is meant by the face in the Divine Comedy. And Dante must know his own divine sharing, participation, first, so that he doesn't lose it in the saints and sages that he meets. Otherwise he would lose himself in meeting the great lights of paradise. And of course he would lose himself when he came to see the divine light unalloyed, the divine face unalloyed, as he does at the end. It's not about losing himself, it's actually about this joining together of finding himself and so finding others and finding the divine too. Personhood increases, you might say. Now, this seems opposed to some Vedantic traditions which do stress a loss of the self in order to return to the one. Although I think it's not so in those traditions that see experience, see us, see life, reality as we most immediately are inclined to know it, as the Leela or dance of Brahman. And Maya then is seen as ignorance about the nature of reality rather than experience itself being a straightforward delusion which must be let go of. And of course, in that negative reading, the ultimate experience that must be let go of is the delusion of the self. Now, I think that there's another Vedantic tradition which is actually commensurate with Dante's experience that sees Maya as ignorance about the nature of the self. And when the self is properly understood, it's understood to share the divine self. So this perhaps starts to shed a new light on this trinity of dissociation, projection, and introjection, because the three together build this individuality, expand it into the divine presence, which Dante then can share because he sees his face, he sees the faces of others, their presence, and so sees the divine. And Beatrice serves this process throughout the paradise. She's his guide and teacher there, and what she shows very skillfully, remember she's a teacher, she understands what's going on in Dante's mind and so can meet his mind with her mind to reveal the divine mind, is that from Dante's dissociated, separate state, fallen state, say, he projects onto her his questions, his yearning, his intuitions, his imagination, and so sees more of the divine life in her when she skillfully offers back what's right about his projection, and he can then introject that into himself. So this dynamic builds up between them where his separation that produces through his eros, through his yearning, projections onto her through his imagination. She can discern and feed back to him in her eyes that he can then introject. That's how she operates as guide and teacher in their discussions, in what she reveals to him step by step. And eventually she corrects, in fact, his understanding of what it is to be fallen or separate, as if it was the wound that made him. She, I think, says that fracture or trauma or dissociation is not the whole story by a long stretch. She explains rather that to be fallen is to turn creativity into a defensive or possessive or unwise way of responding to the divine creation. It's unwise, she explains, because it's too eager. It doesn't give enough time for the individual to expand into the divine awareness, and rather tries to grab the divine awareness. It tries to make itself a God rather than grow into God. You might say in time, it takes time to know eternity. And incidentally, I think this is very illuminating as to why, for example, psychedelic experience takes time to integrate, or why most people gradually grow into enlightenment, even on the direct path where a glimpse of enlightenment is transmitted as early as possible. It still takes people time, for the most part, to become aligned to that insight. And even those that get a blast of enlightenment, where life dramatically changes in an instant, then have to spend a long time working out how to carry on living, how to do this integration. This process which Beatrice offers to Dante is something which we all can undertake, which is why Dante describes it, of course. But the point is that creativity is prior and basic in our becoming who we are, realizing our divinity, rather than serving mind at large to know itself. Mind at large is serving us to know itself, not the other way round. So correcting, I think, that mistaken, inadequate idea of God arriving from German idealism. Now, this takes us then to the divine nature and what a Trinitarian understanding might have to offer here, how it extends this notion. And think first of all about the role of trinities as an understanding of oneness. Now, Aristotle's onto this. He said that 3 is the perfect number, not 1, because 3 contains within itself, say, beginning, middle, and end. And so it's a greater whole than a straightforward 1. Plato has lots of 3s showing up as well. The good, the beautiful, and the true is one of his famous trinities. And the point is that they need each other to reveal the unity of all things. If you have just one, you don't have all. This is shown up in the strange paradox of Kant's categorical imperative. So, for example, in that, Kant says you should always tell the truth, you shouldn't lie. But when the truth is all that orientates your life, it's very easy to find situations where that doesn't seem to work. And the famous one is when your Jewish neighbour has hidden in your house and the Nazi officer knocks on the door and asks whether they are there. Should you lie or not? Kant would say you shouldn't. But with the Platonic idea, where truth is linked to what's good and beautiful to know the all, you can see that it would be a good thing to lie in that situation where your Jewish neighbour is being hidden from the Nazi officer. And the good coupled to the truthful there allows a deeper truth to show up. You might say it's beyond just sheer rule. And so good, beautiful and true need to be working in a dynamic together, Plato stresses, to show up the unity of all things. It's a living sense of living well that's dynamic, not static. It's about love as much as rule, the logos as love as much as the logos as rule, as in fact Dante implies when he meets Cato, the ancient Stoic, who has been saved, but is having to learn that his old Stoic understanding of the logos as rule must give way to the fuller understanding of the logos as love, as dynamic, not static, as living, not just as a dead pattern. So this manifests itself in Trinitarian thought, this understanding of the oneness that's known through a threeness, by God giving and receiving within God's self, not having to step outside of God's self to do that, but within God's self. Now, this works because in the divine realm, the giving can only be the giving of God, as God is all. And so that's why in the Trinitarian understanding, kenosis, the giving, is also ecstasis, the expansion. The emptying is simultaneously a filling. And this resonates with reflections on the notion of emptiness in spiritual traditions, of course, which isn't a void, which isn't less, but it's the emptiness that is all. It's the origining, and originated, all being one. Father, Son and Holy Spirit are the traditional words for that in Trinitarian thought, which is pretty misleading these days. But the inner dynamic is this sense of how the giving and the receiving is one in God, because kenosis is ecstasis, because origins and originated are all one. It's the threefoldness of oneness. And when this is detected, you can be sure that you're stepping towards a transcendent perspective, this Trinitarian understanding would say. To use Dante's schema, you might say that monadic thinking of separateness, disconnection and so on is hell. That's what the souls experience when Dante encounters them in hell, isolation. Dual or dipolar thinking starts showing up in purgatory. So, for example, contraries start to show up like time and eternity, or past and future, or self and others. And that's a more dynamic state in purgatory that leads to the perception in paradise, which is increasingly Trinitarian. It's consciousness in all its fullness, because the three then gives back to one as it realizes the all that is all, the one that is the many. It's a bit like steam, fluid and ice all being manifestations of water, but now known in its fullest way. So that our lives might add something to mind at large, to divine life, is, I think, a misconceived question. Because in eternity and in infinity, nothing can be added. Rather, it's the nature of infinity to always already be enjoying, knowing, adding more, except that more is already part of the divine life. That's the intuition we're invited to try and raise our sights to, which Dante has to work at through the paradise. What's added is already God, much as the Spirit is from God and is God. Hence, creativity, because it's the nature of mind at large, not something God sort of decides to do, like one day God wasn't creating and the next day God was, is part of this sense that abundance, not lack, is the nature of reality when fully understood. And this is captured not only in Christian understandings of the Trinity, but also in Indian understandings, the famous Trinitarian formulation there being Satchit Ananda, being, consciousness and bliss. Those three fullnesses mutually illuminating to show the fullness of the divine nature which we are invited to know too. Now, introspection and projection support this sense of things, I think, because coupled to dissociation or fallenness, their task is restoring the abundance to what otherwise feels like a limited or suffering life, to know life revealed as always full. And Dante describes this in various ways in the Paradise. One, I think, particularly illuminating way he describes this, given this is partly a philosophical discussion, is that he has to pass the bright light of solar rational awareness in the sphere of the sun to discern the subtler lights that follow in the spheres of Mars, Jupiter and Saturn. And the subtler light of Mars particularly is the dynamic of sacrifice, by which his possessed rationality must give way to discerning the greater rationality or intelligence around him. And then in Jupiter, it's about harmony, where his individuality increasingly is seen to harmonize with the individuality of the other souls, but also with the oneness of the divine life. And then in the sphere of Saturn comes his first real silence, his first apophatic or aporetic moment. And it's then that the emptiness starts to reveal itself to him as the fullness. And Dante then goes on to celebrate that increasingly emergent fullness by talking about faith, hope and love, another trinity. Truth, you might say, is akin to faith, because we have faith in truth. Hope is placed in what's good. Love loves or is attracted to what's beautiful. So faith, hope and love are quite close to Plato's good, beautiful and true. And with that celebration, the fullness of the emptiness, Dante's humanity appears to him most fully as well. He starts to see faces. He sees the first face, actually, which is when he meets the aboriginal human, Adam, with the divine intimacy of the aboriginal human restored. And you might say that he knows now his face, his divine presence, so he can see the divine presence of everyone else around him and know that everywhere, therefore, is the face of God, is the divine presence. And so the next thing that happens is that he has his first direct glimpse of God in God's self, initially as an infinitesimally small point of infinite light, but he knows that everything comes from that and everything is within that. It's the circumference that is the centre, and the centre that's the circumference of all things. And so he's on the threshold of the Empyrean understanding, which transcends space and time, though holds all space and time, and transmits eternity to us now, because eternity contains space and time. Now, the intellect remains crucial here to aligning with the divine intelligence all along, just to stress this business about how it's not a return to pure instinct. The angels that Dante sees around God are the obvious manifestation of this. They appear in the hierarchies of the dynamic forms, the loving, transmitting, participating, patterning of the cosmos. And Dante becomes capable of seeing them more and more in their glorious detail. But this still leaves, I think, some issues for me, for this understanding. And one of them comes from within the Divine Comedy itself, because as Dante participates more and more in consciousness in all its fullness, in the divine life, phenomenally, metacognitively and eternally, the issue comes up of his memory. He says many times that he can remember less and less of this. And I think that how to understand this is that this is because memory is part of timed existence, temporal life, and so isn't part of eternal life. you might say that everything is known directly in a kind of eternal now. And Dante has to say to us that trying to put this eternal now in all its fullness into words is to be undone by a kind of ontological flooding. It's not possible to do it even as he expresses more and more of it. And so ultimately the Divine Comedy falls into the great silence, which is how it ends with the famous words, spinning with the love that moves the sun and the other stars. This is the only way really to be fully conscious of all. That's why silence lies at the basis of spiritual awareness. Though in mortal life, it manifests in many things being said, sometimes even contradictory seeming things being said, the multiple traditions that constantly reflect on the one truth across history as well as place, who knows, maybe on different planets as well as this one. And so I think that's how to understand this business about the difficulty of speaking of these things. You might say that language itself is a product of dissociation, of the fallenness, that then projection and introjection use insofar as they can until language too must fall away. It's the edges of words that matter. It's why poetry is the natural language for Dante of revealing these things, of understanding. And, in this life, I think as we move more and more to the divine understanding, we move from generalizations beyond the scientific discourse to the minute particulars, as Blake put it, of everyday awareness of eternity experienced in time, of the all experienced in the particular. As Blake puts it, it's to kiss the joy as it flies and lives in eternity's sunrise, not to try and bind yourself the joy as abstractions tend to do, initially for good use to aid understanding, but they must be let go of as well, which Dante understands. Another issue which Bernardo rightly emphasizes many times in his discussions is the issue of suffering and the meaning of suffering. And in his version of Idealism, suffering takes on a meaning because it is yielded to the whole. It's aiding mind at large to understand itself. It's nature's way of growing in self-awareness. And, I can understand the sense of that. It's the price we pay for being part of nature, you might say. And so while suffering certainly happens, it is at least given meaning in this way. Now, Dante has a different understanding of the significance of suffering. Just to always preface what I say about suffering by being wary of swift answers, because suffering is suffering. And in fact, Dante kind of learns that there's not a full understanding of suffering this side of eternity. But he does intimate that suffering and the experience of suffering transforms through hell, through purgatory, into paradise. In hell, it's just straightforward torture and terrible. In purgatory, it starts to become part of the work of life, and so is accompanied by hope. It's the way in which the Buddhists say the obstacles become the way. And then in paradise, where interestingly Dante does suffer, although it's not in a tortuous way now. For example, he does go blind in paradise, but he knows then that this experience is because he's on the threshold of more and more and more and more. And so it's been transformed into an experience of restoration, of expansion. And I think there's something at least worth holding on to that, because when we can learn to lean into our suffering, it does become the route to expansion in life, at least some forms of suffering, and the sufferings that we're inclined to sustain within ourselves, as opposed to, say, the sufferings that are inflicted on us by others, traumas. Dante, I think, is right to see how suffering changes as we develop more of a subspecie eternitatis kind of perspective. This leads to a second question, which Bernardo's really good at asking, which is, what is life? He has a good answer here, which is that a living entity is a dissociated entity. To be animated is to have an inner life that feels, in some significant perspective, separate from mind at large. Dante's answer to what is life would be different. He would say that we are myriad creaturely images of the one creator, and we humans are just one creature amongst many creatures. He would say that we're distinctive because we are capable of sharing all of divine life consciously, in the metacognitive sense, though all of life ultimately will be returned to the divine life and so share it fully as well. A nice image he has of this is imagining a mountain reflected in a perfectly still lake. And if you were looking at this image of the mountain and its reflection, you might start to wonder which was the origin and which was the image, the mountain or the reflection, and see how they come together and don't add to the mountain but amplify the mountain's image. That's part of what it is to be living and to be returning to an awareness that was always true, that we're in the divine life. The key indicator here is knowing more of life, and knowing it particularly with the experience of freedom. You know, to be fallen, to be dissociated is to be unfree. To develop skillfulness with projection and introjection is to become freer in terms of engaging with life. And so when Dante is at the end of his journey in paradise, he's able to be freely in the divine. He's able to move around the Empyrean, but which is of course not moving at all because it's beyond space and time. He's able to desire, but not out of a sense of lack, but out of a full awareness that there's always more. So it's a desire that always satisfies rather than leaves us wanting more. That's the difference with paradisal desire. And similarly, it's a kind of coincidence of not knowing and knowing rather than the frustration merely of not knowing, because not knowing and knowing in paradise unfold into each other. They're part and parcel of one another in infinity, in the divine life where more is always already more of divine life. Now this question of why we can't read each other's thoughts then, which Bernardo has such a good answer for, in that we're dissociated, alters that we don't have inferential capacities in each other. Just one thing about that is I'm not so sure that we can't know each other's thoughts actually. It seems to me that maybe not kind of stage telepathy is that common, but things like transference and countertransference, the exchange of moods and feelings, even thoughts and images, is actually quite common. So I'm not so sure that we're quite so separate as we often think. Well, of course, we're not separate at all, as we are inclined to think, but even in this fallen state. And I think that we're mistaken about what we share, because that is the way in which we grow into divine freedom. It's the obstacles being the way. It's the yearning becoming a revelation, and that happening as freedom in divine life grows, which is the whole point of Dante's description of his journey in the paradise. And it shows up in the paradise because then minds do know each other's thoughts fully, but not because of some sort of exchange of information in a dipolar way, but because they all share in the divine mind. So again, this is about sharing the divine mind, not being about losing yourself, by knowing who you are more and more, and that opens up who others are more and more, because they too are already in the more and more that is God. I think there's an analogue here that helps us as well in the evolution of language, and analogue in the Platonic sense of tipping us to the unknowing that makes us ready for a deeper insight. When you think about language and how it consists of feelings and thoughts and nouns, verbs and so on. And actually this is one of Philip Goff's critiques of Bernardo, that how feelings become thoughts, and Owen Barfield, who I'm so deeply influenced by, I think showed quite clearly that thoughts and feelings and nouns and so on were less separate in the past and have only become separated in more recent times, saying about the last well, particularly there's been a big rush of the separation in the last 500 years or so. So you take a word like light, for example. I mean, it can mean the light that surrounds us. It can mean feeling light, an emotion. It can mean feeling enlightened, receiving a thought, an aha moment. And what Barfield said is that these three or more meanings of words like light, in fact he thought that all words probably, they become separate from the withdrawal of participation, this sense of being separate. But that is in itself a preparation for a return with more freedom via projection and introjection. And it's just that we happen to be at a state in the evolution of our species, certainly in the West, where we're at a moment of quite intensive alienation or withdrawal, and so tend to think these things are separate. But language itself, because of the nature of words and how they change meaning, show us that at heart, thoughts and feelings and nouns are one and the same when we have the full experience of reality. And so language can be an aid to us in this way. What is going on in the evolution of language has an evolutionary story too. I borrow a lot in terms of my understanding of evolution from the evolutionary biologist Simon Conway Morris at Cambridge, who stresses that human beings are the creature that have become more and more consciously capable of exploring niches in the environment. And Conway Morris is unlike other evolutionists that use the idea of niche, because he talks about immaterial as well as material niches. You know, the species we call fish explore the material niche of the sea. The species that we call birds explore the material niche of the air. Well, we human beings are the creature that explore immaterial niches as well, not least of which are the niches called the good, the beautiful and the true that exist in reality. And evolution then here is seen as a kind of search mechanism, mechanism of projection and introjection in this case, and so leads to our return, doesn't just leave us isolated. Metaphysically then, this gives a kind of conceptual understanding here, because it's another aspect of creativity. It's in the divine nature to always be more, in the divine nature being infinite. So reality waking to the source that made it all is our metacognitive experience of that. Our life mirrors Trinitarian life. We see the giving initially as a loss, hoping it will return something, which isn't the divine experience of kenosis and ecstasis. Withdrawal and enrichment is one and the same experience, which we get intimations of. Hence it's very common in spiritual traditions to talk about the giving and the receiving. This isn't fundamentally a moral imperative, it's actually an ontological invitation. So look, let me draw things to a close. Maybe there's three useful things in what I've said, just to stick to the theme of threes. The first would be that to dissociation, I think, needs to be added the other mental dynamics of projection and introjection. And then you have the full story of falling and returning, but returning with the difference of freedom for our benefit, not for the benefit of the divine, which already is full of benefits. The second area would be to consider how this top-down eternity perspective, rather than the bottom-up, more empirical perspective, is really crucial. And when we struggle to receive inspiration from the divine perspective as much as wrestle with what we know from within our own perspectives, the coupling together then leads into more and more. And then the third would be that this Trinitarian dynamic, as explored particularly in the Christian tradition, I think offers a way of conceiving of mind at large, not as needing us to know itself, but rather as loving us to share in the divine life, which is actually our state already. Theosis is becoming aware of our true nature. And this isn't actually just in the Christian tradition, I mentioned the Vedantic tradition which it's in, and maybe just to finish with a thought from the Sufi tradition, where there's a famous hadith in Sufi mystical thought which says, "I was a treasure unknown, then I desired to be known, so I created a creation to which I made myself known, then they knew me." And note here that knowing is the participative sense of sharing in the divine life, not just the metacognitive sense.